Hello, I am Georgina Rose, a perennialist and polytheist, and welcome to Pagan Perspectives, a podcast where I take mundane or common things that we deal with in our life, or issues that we approach, or subject matters that we deal with, and offer a pagan perspective on how to deal with them, what they mean, and generally help people understand the confusing world we live in through the power of esotericism, religion, and mysticism. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about two things that historically have been very linked, but in the modern day are seen as completely different, contradictory even. And that would be science and spirituality. In most people's minds, these things don't go together. In fact, a lot of people think you cannot believe in both. I have often had many people who, know that I'm a occultist and a pagan who immediately assume all sorts of things about what I believe about health, medicine, science. Like, people have a lot of ideas. And I think our culture really encourages this. And I'm going to get into the complex history as to why and what happened to separate religion and science and why we have the relationship we have with today. Because for most of history, that's not been the case. In antiquity, it wasn't the case. And in fact, and this is going to be shocking to so many people, I'm going to share this story. The diversion between science and mysticism didn't happen until the 1800s. I'm serious. Until then, they were linked so closely. And now people really do not think those things can possibly go together. So I'm going to explore the history of these things, the occult and spiritual roots of a lot of modern science, and why this is the state of the way things are. So to begin, I think it's worth exploring what science was viewed as in the ancient world. Because obviously, when we're talking about religion, one of the things that historians say defines a civilization and marks the difference between being cave people and having a civilization is an understanding of religion. So obviously, there are certain architectural feats that go along with that, like the ability to, produce things like wheels and build buildings and have sort of a shared language. Those are, of course, key things that mark the difference between, primitive culture, and by that I mean like literally cave people, not like undeveloped cultures, and then like the mark of a civilization, right? And that is why historians define the first civilization as being the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, then the Egyptians, and then the Greeks, and so on, right? It was all those things were kind of the factors that needed to exist to mark a civilizational group, and religion came with that. Prior to civilization, though, there was a understanding of religion that we just wouldn't use that word to refer to, and that would be animism. So from our very earliest records of humans existing as humans, we see cave paintings. Cave paintings, of course, are our insight into how the very oldest ancestors we had lived. And there are multiple cave paintings that we can assume relate to some religious idea. As well, when they are discoveries of uncontacted tribes who have not established a civilizational structure, or what we would call a modern civilizational structure, there is a pretty cohesive and coherent religious through line, right? All religious cultures kind of emerged with the same idea, and that would be animism. Animism, I think, no matter what religion you are, you believe is true to some extent. And that is the idea that everything has a spiritual nature to it. There is a spirit to the trees, there is a spirit to the ground, there is a spirit to the air, there is a spirit to everything. And so, we know animism existed. But then, of course, once people develop like societies and whatnot, they basically see animism and they go, well, things must be a little more complicated than that. And so then you develop religion. And when we look at the development of religion, we actually see the development of science going directly from it. Because when we think about science, a lot of the basis of science is arithmetic or math. And the first math was actually done to calculate the position of Mars in the sky so that astrologers could have a better understanding of what's going on. Astrology, a lot of people think of that as like newspaper horoscopes, or assume it's a more modern idea. Astrology is one of the most ancient ideas humanity has had. Basically, that the movement of the stars, affect our lives in some way. And if you think about it, like it's pretty logical to think that there's a divine nature to the stars, right? The stars give us directions, they are a compass out of the darkness, and the sun, which is a star, is the reason why we are alive. If there was no sunlight, we would die. And when the sun eventually explodes, if humanity has not gone extinct by then, we will all die. Nice uplifting thing to think about. But it's true, right? So ascribing a spiritual tendency to the stars is kind of like a natural thing to do. I'm sure you all have like looked up at the stars and had that really sublime moment where you realize how small you are and how vast the universe is and whatnot. It's pretty easy to come to that conclusion. And once we came to the conclusion as humanity that the stars have a spiritual quality to them, we wanted to understand them. And to understand the stars, you have to develop math. Because if you're seeing that they affect your lives in some way, you need to be able to track their movements, right? Like if this thing is spiritually powerful, then we notice that it moves all the time, that we see different stars and that, the seasons change and whatnot. Like it makes sense to want to understand why those work. And so the same curious instinct that sparked humanity to discover religion and discover spirituality is the same instinct that makes us want to have an understanding of the reality around us. There's a reason why metaphysics is called meta physics. That word physics is there for a reason. It's very natural for those tendencies that draw people to spirituality to also draw them to want to understand the world. So we developed math to track the stars. That was the first use of math, was to understand why they move, so that astrologers, or people who interpret the movement of the stars' impact on our lives, could have a better understanding of things. As well, a primitive technology that was developed for religious purposes is the sundial. So the sundial is basically the original way to track the movements of the day, and that just tracks the sun in the sky. There are these little structures that people build. You can see them at some archaeological sites and some museums. And, people, obviously, the sun is a very common thing to worship, just logically, right? The sun brings us light, the sun brings us warmth. And in a lot of climates, the sun is the thing that, you can work under, you can harvest under, it gives you the ability to survive. Like, obviously, in the ancient world, when we didn't have, nice coats and, heating systems, right? The summer was obviously a bit easier and the winter was more brutal. Of course, the opposite is true in desert climates where, people really developed a reverence for the moon, which is something just interesting, that the sun cultures tended to be where it was colder and the moon cultures tended to be where it was a bit hotter. And you get actually different relationships to the sun and the moon depending on the climate of the region. But anyways, people wanted to track the movement of the sun. They developed the sundial, and that is the beginning of us telling time. As well, the movement of the moon was very important for people to track as well, because especially if you lived in a hot desert climate, that is why Arabian cultures really gravitated towards moon worship. You know that at night it's a bit cooler, it's a bit less hot, you want to stay inside more, and so tracking the movement of the moon was developed early on as well. In general, most of these early physics discoveries were in reaction to trying to understand the stars. In fact, the overlap of astrology and astronomy and physics was pretty consistent until that later date that I mentioned. Most of the people who were professional astrologers were also polymaths. They were astronomers. They were the same people. They are different people now. And I actually recall taking an astronomy class in school. And I actually did take it to be a better astrologer, which is really funny. But anyways, I remember the the teacher came out and they were like, okay, this has nothing to do with astrology. That was like the first thing they said. And I was like, oh boy, I'm in for a ride here, aren't I? But, astronomers now are really anti-astrology, actually. You can see like astronomers on Twitter go on and on about they hate astrology. But the thing is, even if you don't believe in astrology, if you're an astronomer, you should understand that you would not have any of those calculations that people use now without that interest in astrology. These were the same people. In fact, the culture known as the Sabians, or essentially a group of people in Haran or northern Syria and southern Turkey, that kind of region, they were actually known as some of the strongest mathematicians and astronomers in the world because they were a star worship region. So the Sabians of Haran are a really interesting religious group. We have a little bit of their beliefs kept in this book called Nabatean Agriculture. Doesn't sound like a religious book, which is interesting because a book that's called Nabatean Agriculture is actually a religious book. It's literally like the same information. They were basically known as like the people who understood the stars the most. There are some speculations that perhaps the wise men of the Bible were the Sabians of Haran. Now, of course, that is disputed. There are many other theories on who those people might have been, but regardless, the people who were coming up with astronomy and who created all these formulas were astrologers, kind of the same people. Now, another thing that should also be brought up is our understanding of plants and biology and whatnot also has a spiritual root. In the ancient world, of course, we did not have modern understandings of biology, but we had to discover it somehow. And specifically, that was through our interactions with plants. It is possibly theorized by some theories now that actually plants were how we became distinct from other species in our class. It's sillily called the stoned ape theory, which, okay, don't love that name, but basically the theory posits that the reason why we were able to develop language, or the way we communicate, was through us developing synesthesia, or the ability to associate things that are abstract with sounds and colors. So basically, that type of thinking is not present in many animals, right? Basically, like they can make sounds at each other, but they can't associate sounds with abstract things. To be able to have language, you have to think in really intense abstractions. And many people believe, and this is actually emerging as a pretty plausible and likely scientific theory, that the reason why we were able to develop these associations and develop essentially synesthesia is because we consumed psychedelic plants. And basically, these psychedelics, of course, when you consume a psychedelic, it does fragment your thinking a bit. It gives you a stronger sense of lateral thinking. And it allows you to associate distant things with each other. That's why when you take too many psychedelics, you fry your brain, right? You essentially develop a sort of ability to pattern match and see distant things as related. Like you can associate red with the word red, and so on and so on. So it's quite possible that our consumption of psychedelic drugs, which of course, restructure the brain and create lateral thinking, could have been from our ancient ancestors consuming those plants and then being able to associate sounds with objects, and then that becoming the way we were able to develop language. Now, of course, that's a theory. We're not 100% sure, but it is actually quite likely because we do understand that ancient humans were eating psychedelic mushrooms at a pretty high rate. So yeah, plants themselves, were spiritualized, right? We understand that entheogens, or the ability of using a plant with a psychoactive property in order to create a spiritual effect, is heavily used in many cultures. You see the Sufis use it with caffeine. We see the shamans of South America use it with ayahuasca. We see people in Europe using mugwort to induce dreams, like all sorts of things. Entheogens are not just psychedelics; they are even things like caffeine and alcohol. And the thing is with plants is we understand those can induce effects, all those substances, but why would that not apply to all plants? And so the study of plants and their spiritual properties was a big part of ancient life. In fact, the people who were the original plant magicians really helped us understand what was poison and what was not. Essentially, the reason why we know what plants kill us is someone ate them and died, and contributed to our understanding of fear and all of that. But, anyways, plants were very interesting. In fact, in the ancient Hellenic world, there was a term called magia naturalis, or natural magic. And natural magic was the spiritual understanding of the natural world. That included plants and that included the stars. And a lot of these early understanding of plants comes from magia naturalis. If you look at old and even modern, like herbal encyclopedias of different plants people use for medicine and whatnot, there is typically always myth and folklore associated with it. In fact, the folklore we have about plants actually can predict later things. Most interestingly, St. John's wort, or a plant associated with the sun starting in the ancient world, has recently been associated with antidepressants. In fact, people actually can take St. John's wort, provided they're not on an SSRI, and actually their depression goes down. However, a recent scientific discovery shows that St. John's wort, if taken for too long, can actually weaken vision, much like staring at the sun. It gives people, happiness and joy, things associated with the sun, but can also hurt the eyes. Once again, that is a scientific relation. And most of our early understanding of medicine was linked with spirituality. If you read old medicinal texts using herbs, because those were the predecessors to modern drugs, like that we take for sickness, you see often a spiritual relation. All these medicinal plants had spiritual correspondences. And the people who were developing herbal medicine, which many modern medicinal cures use herbs in them, were often folk magicians. They were people who were folklorists. They were people who were very invested in the magical quality of this. In general, these folk healers were the proto doctor. I mean, the term witch doctor now is used pretty derogatorily, but that was the original doctor. They were people with plants. In fact, if you go through history, you see that midwifery was actually very spiritual for most of history. And now, of course, midwifery is the predecessor to modern obstetrics and understanding of women's health. So we're seeing pretty clearly that these ancient understandings are what create the foundation for modern understandings. As well, there were a lot of really complex medicinal systems that were rooted in sacred text. In the Indian subcontinent, there is something known as Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a very complex medical system that also has to do with activities and exercises. It's very, very elaborate. That actually has roots in the Vedic scriptures. And Ayurveda actually is known to have pretty positive effects on people's health. A lot of people choose Ayurveda as a medicinal path. As well, the same is quite similar with traditional Chinese medicine, though personally, I know a lot less about TCM than I do about Ayurveda because I myself have dabbled in some Ayurvedic stuff and found pretty strong results. As well, the idea of soma types, or the idea that there are different body types that need different exercises and different, things that they consume, really is first discussed discussed in Ayurveda, with Ayurveda arguing that there are different doshas, or essentially like types that you have, or elemental balances that you deal with differently. They have three main doshas: Vata, Kapha, and Pitta. And we actually see now in modern physiology the soma types. Though some people disagree with the soma types now, they are kind of a more recent understanding of body types. The soma types are ectomorph, endomorph, and mesomorph. And in fact, you can actually directly line the dosha types from Ayurveda to modern soma types. Now, some sports medicine people now don't like soma types. They think they are reductionistic. Basically, they just think they're too simple, like there are more than three types. So, of course, there are more complex understandings of soma types now, but essentially that idea actually has roots in Vedic theology. As well, disciplines like yoga, which now are known to have intense physical benefits, are religious things. Yoga is not stretching. Yoga is a devotion to Hindu gods and Hindu religion. That is the truth. I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with that truth, or say that that's playing into like Christian anti-yoga sentiment or whatever, but it is true. I mean, I think Christians who are weird about yoga because they think it's worshiping Hindu gods actually are kind of right. I think if you're a devout Christian, I don't know why you're doing yoga. Yoga is based in the Vedic scriptures. So I think re-spiritualizing yoga would actually be really good, and understanding that it is a worshiping way towards the gods. I think the more spiritualized yoga is, the better. So I don't really care if Christians stop doing yoga. Not my problem. I think yoga should be recognized as a spiritual discipline. Furthermore, in modern psychological and psychiatric literature, it is well understood that meditation and mindfulness are beneficial. This is heavily pushed now. If you go to a modern therapist, they will teach you breathing exercises. And it is actually known that breathing exercises can get people out of panic attacks, it can slow the heart rate, and it can be able to mediate pain and chronic pain. Those techniques are religious in origin. Meditation comes from many religious traditions. Of course, we most associate it with Buddhism, and it's obviously a huge part of Buddhism, but similar ideas exist universally. The idea of taking time to be silent is very important. All of these things are known to have immense psychological benefits and are actually being pushed more and more by psychology as time goes on. Those are spiritual in root. In general, like most of science and psychology actually comes from religion and religious people considering their gods. Furthermore, I think it is worth exploring some sort of older forms of science that are not used as much, that literally directly come from spirituality, specifically humoric medicine, which is not used anymore. Essentially, the idea that there are four humors, or sort of components that a person needs to balance out. That actually comes from elemental understanding of spirituality. Now, of course, humors are not used in a medicinal sense because a number of ways people would balance the humors are known to be like dangerous now. Like we're not putting leashes on people anymore, and I don't think we should. But humoric medicine was a huge idea in medicine for a long time, and that literally comes from like spiritual text, like verbatim. As well, personality and personality typing. I mean, personality can't be like quantitatively measured, right? The sense of the self, the sense of who we are, that can't be measured. That actually also comes from spiritual writings about archetypes, and once again, humoric writings like the Four Temperaments. All of that is rooted in spiritual stuff. Now, I think it is also worth exploring alchemy. So, alchemy is often described as the predecessor to chemistry, or like proto chemistry. And definitely that is somewhat true. I do think it is reductionistic to think of alchemy solely as physical alchemy, or people, mixing things together, right? Of course, that was a huge part of alchemy. Like if you read alchemical texts, there's a lot of instructions on that. But alchemy is as spiritual and philosophical as it is physical. The reason why those physical alchemy combinations were done is essentially the philosophy of alchemy is about combining different things to create a more purified form. And all those crazy experiments people did, some successful, some horrible, if they were not done, there would not be a lot of modern understandings of chemistry. Now, of course, practical alchemy is not what modern chemists are doing. I'm not saying it is, but without it, we would not have a lot of that knowledge. Like in general, medicine hinges on people trying things for spirituality. As well, in more recent time, there have been actual scientific discoveries that come from spiritual roots. And I'm going to get to that in a bit as I get further into this podcast. But now I want to talk about basically why science and spirituality started splitting. Because for most of history, scientists and doctors were religious people. In fact, a lot of people who were like doctors were spiritual leaders. They were shamans, they were healers, they were midwives, they were people who often would get accused of things like witchcraft and whatnot. And even in like accepted science, like, normie science, mostly people were religious. Like a lot of the people who created these various modern formulas that people use to understand all sorts of things about the modern world were pretty open about their religious beliefs. They would pray before they did their experiments. They would, say that this is an amazing way to understand God and the universe. Like they saw science as an extension of spirituality. They saw the discovery of science as a way to worship, as a way to seek gnosis, and as a way to get closer to God. Now, where this starts splitting is in the 1800s with the rise of Darwin. So, Darwin was a vitally important scientist who created a number of theories, things like survival of the fittest and so on, but most importantly, evolution. So, evolution was a game changer and when science and religion cut themselves off essentially. Now, of course, there had been previous complications where scientific discoveries kind of went against certain religious beliefs. We know this with like the idea of like, does the everything circle the earth or does everything circle the sun? That was, of course, the guy who came up with that idea was persecuted and basically, not treated so well. He was really condemned because they believed that went against the religion at the time. And of course, that has been a consistent thing as well. If a scientific discovery had gone against a religious idea, people would freak out. And I think that's very silly. I think we should keep discovering and keep exploring and not just like go, okay, well, like if something goes against religion, it shouldn't be explored. Because the thing is, I think religion, just like science, is constantly being discovered or whatever. So just to be clear, I do condemn that happening, even though I'm a pagan. Anyways, though, evolution really bothered a lot of people, specifically because, by the time we're in the 1800s, this is Christian world. Like the world is Christian at this point. And this is like kind of right around the Enlightenment too. I've mentioned the Enlightenment a few times. It was a very important philosophical movement. It's kind of when the world changed and the world started moving towards secular religion and away from Christianity. It was a big, big thing where basically people started prizing rationalism and reason, and people's values shifted, and you get kind of modern like values that people hold. The Enlightenment just big, like everything changed at that point. That's kind of when like modernity that we know of really began was with the Enlightenment, and that's when things like the French Revolution and the American Revolution happened. Monarchy started falling out of favor. New values emerged. Whatever, right? But basically, this whole evolution thing's happening around this time, which is kind of gas on the fire because a lot of Christians really felt that evolution, because of course the Bible says that the world was created in only a few days. If we evolve from monkeys, that changes things. As well, Christianity posits humans as the only creature with free will and as that being our distinction from the animal world. And so, yeah, basically a big, big blow to Christianity. Now, the thing is, if you are not a Christian, evolution doesn't really change anything. Like, I think if you're not part of Christianity, like the fact evolution has been pretty much like a leading theory for a long time, I don't think it debunks your religion. Even within Christianity, I don't think evolution debunks anything because I mean, obviously, like God has been around for longer than humans. So, as many people say, what is a day in the eye of God? And then that's how a lot of Christians nowadays square evolution with Christian understanding. Now, there are a lot of Christians who call themselves like creationists who don't believe in evolution and whatnot. And that's going to add fuel to the fire of things separating. Basically, at the time, a lot of Christians were creationist and did not like evolution being a discussion. They were furious about it. And there still are many Christians who feel that way. Now, I will say I've known a lot of Christians and I haven't met many who don't believe in evolution. Like, I think in 2025, creationism is pretty unpopular, but it does still exist. But, anyways, at this point, you're seeing a big stark gap between the main religion in the West, Christianity, and science. And so things start to split in a major way. Scientists increasingly become atheist or rejectors of religion, and religious people increasingly see science as hostile. In fact, I would say a lot of modern people in all spiritual fields see religion as something that is hostile to their beliefs. And, I see many people who are very into science who think religion is some primitive thing that humanity should have moved past by at this point. Like it's some idea from the past that doesn't matter anymore. Like it's okay. We're in a different time. And I find this deviation odd because what happened is basically like this evolution thing was the big blow, and then people were like, well, okay, if all these complex things exist, then how on earth can religion exist? And then we get discoveries like the Big Bang Theory, or the idea that the world began in a big explosion. And then people are like, well, that means creation theories of like that religions have, because all religions have like a creation, theory or story or myth, where there's some religious thing that happens that created humanity. Those things can't coexist, they contrast, right? People just start seeing things as like, okay, well, these things are in opposition. Modern science has debunked religion. But the thing is, modern science has done nothing to disprove that gods or God exist. They can't. They literally can't disprove that, but they can disprove, like, they can say, like, okay, well, this is how things started, this is how humans evolved. Once again, I think these things don't actually contradict. I think this is like a false contradiction. Like, I think, like, the idea that, like, if various things happen, these things can't exist. Because let's be real, like, there are many people who see the myths as more metaphorical, and there are many ways to literally see what happened in the myth and things like the Big Bang and like evolution as like completely colliding things. Like, these descriptions can actually line up. Like, the universe had to begin somewhere. So, like, when we were created, like, if there was some big explosion to start that, how does it even contradict? And when we look at like Kabbalistic eschatology, we understand that the way that things emerge from nothingness. So, in Kabbalah, a form of mysticism that originates in Judaism and then went through Christianity and then went into Hermeticism and so on and so on. Essentially, there are these layers of nothingness, or the layers of Ein, and then from Ein, there becomes the point in the circle. So the point in the circle is that drawing that is the sun symbol and the monad symbol in polytheistic religions that come from monism, or the belief that all is one. And essentially what happens is, from nothingness, a point in the circle emerges, and then from the point in the circle, there is the lightning flash downwards. Think of that image, the lightning flash, and then it goes through various spheres, various levels of existence, from the gods down through, the lesser spirits, and then through into humanity. And then humanity is that lowest tier of creation that is basically emanating downwards. But think about that image of the lightning flash, right? That image of the flow. Could that, nothing, things emerging from nothingness kind of be represented in that way? I think these images are kind of the same image, honestly. And then, of course, these things are continuously flowing back and forth. And then as the adept moves upwards, they go up the spears in reverse and whatnot and whatnot. But, like, I'm saying, like, these religious understandings and these scientific understandings aren't really in opposition. I mean, if you interpret things like in the Bible incredibly literally, then of course you can see them as contradictory. But anyways, this kind of is what created that divide. That's where it starts. And ever since then, things have become increasingly divided. But I will say, right after this sort of division, there was a sort of pushback from spiritualists. So, of course, during the Enlightenment, there was a lot of societal change. And people often, when they simplify history, they say that this is when disenchantment begins, or the end of myth, and the triumph of reason, the triumph of rationality over the irrational and illogical senses of emotion and spirituality. But that's not true, because literally right after the Enlightenment, there was the Magical Revival. The Magical Revival is a period in Europe and the West in general in which people had a renewed interest in spirituality. This is where religions like Wicca begin, Theosophy, spiritualism, New Thought, Thelema, and all pagan reconstructionism kicked off. Like, literally right after the Enlightenment. And so this is a big historic myth. It's called the myth of disenchantment, or the idea that, like, there was this one day when, like, reason won and, like, religion went away. In general, I think we have this false idea of history that things are linear and that there's some sort of, like, end of history, that, like, one day, like, we'll reach, like, the conclusion, right? Like, we'll reach, like, the solution to everything. And, then everything will just be like a flat line from there. Humanity will have evolved. That's bullshit, okay? And if you open your eyes and read an actual history book, you'll see that this is bullshit. History is cyclical, just like the Wheel of Samsara in spiritual writings. It's a cycle. There are good ages and then there are bad ages. People become better and then they become worse. It seems to be pretty much a circle. It doesn't seem to be a straight line. Now, you can notice general trends over time, but regardless, there's a circle. And right after the Enlightenment, there was the Magical Revival. There were people going to spiritualism cafes where they were all doing, like, seances, like, on the regular. Now, of course, at this point, science and spirituality start kind of dividing, and these people do become different people than, in the past, they would have been the same people, the same curious people. Now they're different curious people. And they kind of become a bit antagonistic towards each other. But spirituality comes back, like, immediately. And actually, during this time, there was another attempt to bridge spirituality and science. And that would be called scientific illuminism. So, scientific illuminism is an idea most associated with the religion of Thelema, but you see kind of similar things happening within theosophy as well. And scientific illuminism is the method of science, the aim of religion, or essentially, What if we conduct like scientific experiments using modern scientific ideas to discover the truth about religion? Like, what if we just do that? What if we, take magical records, like someone make a scientific record and like try a form of meditation and then write down our experiences and then have our friend do the same meditation? Like, people applied the scientific method to spirituality. This was very, very popular at this time. And it has fallen out of favor, even amongst Thelemites, the people who were doing that historically, but I still see people talking about it. And there are certain organizations that still cling to this as a key principle. As well, you start to see people, kind of, if we go forward a little bit, if we cut to like the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, we see, of course, the hippies and the new age movement and all that. And you see people trying to like use quantum physics to explain spirituality and prove spirituality. And I'm not a physicist, okay, guys, I'm not, but I do think there is clearly some sort of argument to go on there. As well, you see the interest in psychedelic medicine kind of being another attempt to re spiritualize science. I mean, people now are using various techniques like that to get past post traumatic stress disorder, and the results seem promising. It doesn't seem so contradictory. And once again, things like chaos magic, which is a movement that came out of Thelema and then went on its own direction, in which people kind of have less concern for dogma and just kind of bring a bunch of religious techniques together, the ones that work, and create a practice based on that. Not my thing, but quite popular, kind of just pulling together what works and getting results, is kind of in the spirit of scientific illuminism. It's like, take what works and use it, right? Take what works spiritually and use it in your life. That's not my approach, because I like doctrine, I like philosophy, I like cohesion, and I think it's often better to have a sort of spiritual cohesion. But chaos magic is huge. There's a lot of people doing that. And so there is that re-bridging happening. As well, during the 1940s, there was a specific scientist known as Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a Thelemite and a member of the OTO in California. And he actually created jet propulsion, or the technique that we use to get rockets into space. He actually was completely ridiculed. Everyone laughed at him because what he would do is, when he would do these experiments, he would pray to the god Pan before launching up a rocket. Pan is associated with the phallus, and come on, rockets are phallic. We can see that. And so, he was laughed at. He was made fun of. Like, people were like, we're never going to get to space. Put down those sci fi novels and, do math. And of course, he did a lot of math to do what he did, but he truly created that technology, and space exploration would not exist without Jack Parsons' contribution. However, because science is so antagonistic to spirituality, he actually was written out of history. If you go to like the NASA Museum in Washington D.C., he's mentioned on one plaque only, when he created like the most important technology that caused the space race, that caused a lot of like history that we have now. Like, it was his work. As well, he believed in the force of the will. The reason why he did these experiments, even though people thought he was crazy, is because he would use his will and he would use ritual to get us into space. Like ritual is what did that. Thelemic ritual is why space exploration exists. Like, that's just the truth of the matter. And you can do a lot of reading on that. Jack Parsons was a very interesting man, and in a sense, he was a heretical Thelemite. He actually is one of those people who had very different ideas about Thelema than Crowley. He's worth reading. He wrote about all sorts of things, philosophy, science, and so on and so on. Once again, without him, wouldn't exist. Nowadays, if you try to bring spirituality into a scientific space, you're kind of not allowed to do that. Like how Parsons was sort of persecuted for being a spiritual scientist. If you do that now, it's not taken seriously. And I think this is where people get this critique of modern science as a religion. So I see people critique modern science from the spiritual perspective as either scientism or the cult of science or the religion of science, whatever people want to call it. And it's basically the idea that people say that science has replaced religion, and that people who are really into science, right, the reason why they're so antagonistic in religion is that they've created a secular religion. And academically, defining a religion is a really complicated question. It's hard to do that. Because obviously religion can look very different. Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity are all religions, but they don't behave the same at all. So what defines a religion is kind of a debatable question. It's a interesting one to explore and wonder about. But there is an idea of secular religion in religious scholarship, of basically when you idolize something, to the extent that it is your religion and it forms your worldview and it gives you rituals in your life, that perhaps that could be a religion. And so a lot of people do say that the way people think about science now and relate to science now is religious. And the way people talk about science, is another part of that critique, is that they put it on a pedestal that it cannot be criticized, which I do think some people do this. I will say this critique has some weight to it. But the ironic bit is if you treat science as a religion, you are not understanding science as what it is, because science is not an ideology. Science is not a philosophy, it's a practice. According to the writings that formed science, science is supposed to be a method of exploration. It's not actually like, a dogma. In fact, the core of science is disproving itself and coming up with new theories. And so when people treat science as a religion, they are actually doing as much of a disservice to science as they are to themselves. They have created, a dogma in a way that science is not meant to be dogmatic. It's meant to be a bunch of theories that come together to then prove the universe. And in fact, science cannot consider something a law or something that cannot be disproven until there are specific mathematical equations to back it up. That is why gravity is a law and something like evolution is not. Even things like germ theory or the idea of how pathogens spread and merge, that's a theory. That's not actually a law. And so things are constantly contradicting each other and, testing each other, right? They're constantly up for debate. Of course, theories are accepted as consensus, and that's kind of how people get like the dogmatic way of viewing science. They're like, well, that's what the consensus is, so that is what truth is. But that's not actually the core of what science is. In fact, science is closer to that scientific illuminism way of inquiry than it is to this dogmatic way of thinking. And so the way we view science culturally actually should shift. It should shift to seeing science as what it is instead of as like a rigid way to view the world. Of course, those theories should be studied, but they're not how people make them out to be. Now, the big question is, can science and spirituality converge again? Are we always going to have this antagonistic relationship? I think it's possible, but I think it won't happen soon. I think as time moves on and as science changes, and especially as things like quantum physics and psychedelic medicine are explored on a deeper level, and also the way psychology deals with meditation and mindfulness, I think as these things go on, they could remerge. I do have the fear that perhaps as science and spirituality kind of come back together and science admits the necessity of certain spiritual ideas like meditation in order to create human flourishing, that it could secularize religions. This is one of my concerns. I feel like when you do a practice, you should remember its roots. I think it is disrespectful to a practice to do something and not acknowledge where it comes from and respect where it comes from. I think doing yoga while not reading the Yoga Sutras or the key text of yoga and understanding what it means on a spiritual level is doing yoga wrong. I don't think that's right. I also think if you do meditation, but you don't consider, the philosophy of why people meditate and what it means, you could be doing it wrong. Now, of course, many people will disagree with that. They'll have that kind of chaos magic approach of take what works. But I think if that's taken by everyone, then perhaps we could detach things from their spiritual root. This has happened to a large extent with Buddhism. I tweeted the other day some criticism of Alan Watts, or the guy who kind of brought Buddhism to the West. I critique him. I said that I don't like him, and I didn't really clarify that. And I do want to clarify that right here because this is actually my fear of science exploring spirituality. My one hang up, and why I'm not saying I want them to merge immediately is what happened with Alan Watts is he brought a lot of Buddhist ideas back, but he actually really secularized Buddhism. Buddhism, if you read older Buddhist texts, there are bodhisattvas, there are gods. Like Buddhism is polytheistic. Buddhism has many gods. Buddhism is religious. And what's happened with the secularization of Buddhism, which granted, Alan Watts didn't do all of this. There are many reformist Buddhists who did this as well. If I'm pointing the finger at anyone, it's Alan Watts because that's where most people in the West are getting their kind of atheist Buddhism from. Not wholly him. Maybe it's a bit harsh of me to just say I don't like him and not explain what I mean. I think what it comes down to is, it's a shame to take a religion with really interesting ideas about theology and then turn it into something like secular and just about like meditation. Like for me, I actually had no interest in Buddhism. Like I was like, okay, Buddhism, it's not my thing. Like I don't have any connection to it until I started reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead relatively recently. And that was a big game changer for me because I realized, holy shit, Buddhism is a really like it's a religion. It's not what people have made it out to be. And I worry, as science explores these ideas that are spiritual again, and these things start to inherently kind of come back on each other because when things come from each other, they must come back. That's kind of how pendulums swing. That this could, instead of, people considering like, what if we explore if spirituality is real through experiments? What if we test these things? And there actually was some attempts to test things during the Cold War with remote viewing experiments, which basically was testing if astral projection is real and if you can spy on people with astral projection. Interestingly, those studies actually didn't disprove anything. They were inconclusive, which is actually quite positive for what they were trying to test, remote viewing, something that a lot of even very spiritual people say they struggle to do. So very interesting there. But the thing is, I do worry about secularization. I worry about taking things out of their context and neglecting philosophy and virtue and core ideas that make these ideas what they are. Because when we talk about these ideas, they come from somewhere, and I think it's worth recognizing where they come from. I don't like this detachment, and that's my critique of Alan Watts. I think he did a lot of that. Don't know how intentional it was, but I think that was kind of the impact. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think they should come back, but I hope if they come back, it's not in a way that secularizes the spiritual. It's a way that spiritualizes the secular. Because this idea, like this dichotomy we have of like the sacred and the profane, it's not real. And that's kind of my thesis of this entire Pagan Perspectives podcast, where I explore somewhat mundane or non-spiritual topics from a spiritual perspective, is that the sacred and the profane are not actually dichotomous at all. The tantrics explain it best, where they say even in the most taboo places there is godliness. Really, everything is spiritual. There is no separation between absolutely anything, and thus, how can we even begin to understand the physical reality of the universe without considering the spiritual reality? And so, yeah, I'm pushing back on two things in this podcast. That this is my statement, my final point. I'm pushing back against the spiritualist who just reject science wholly, and I'm pushing back against the scientists who reject spirituality wholly. I think these things go together. Metaphysics. Remember that word. So that's all I have to say for this one. If you like Pagan Perspectives, you get a bonus episode 8 times a year through the Patreon. As well, you get early access to all episodes, and you get a bonus pre-show episode with every main episode of the show. So definitely check that out. I'm Dot Darling, or DAAT Darling, on all platforms under the sun. I also am mostly on YouTube. That's what I'm proud of. But I'm also on Substack, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Threads, all sorts of places. And I also have a Patreon for my independent work outside of the podcast. And as well, I am a professional tarot reader and astrologer. I have booking information in the show notes or YouTube description, depending on where you watch this. If you are watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you are listening to this on a podcasting platform, please like and give this a review, unless it's a bad review, in which case do not, please. And this has been Pagan Perspectives. Please consider how your life is through a pagan view. All right, bye.